Welcome to episode 56 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's #1 open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Eckman, and for this episode, the guys and I wanted to dedicate an entire episode to cameras from the former Soviet Union. Soviet cameras have been discussed in nearly every episode of this show, including the last one, where we covered mirror lenses and Rubens, but for the first time ever, we're going all red. Before we get to that, let's do some introductions. From the great state of Ohio, the man with more Zenits than he has Ladas is Mr. Paul Reibel. Hey, Paul, what is your best-selling Soviet camera?
Well, you know, the thing is, I probably only have one, but I've sold it about 25 times because people keep returning it.
Next, from Sydney, Australia, a city that's 14,500 kilometers from Moscow, is Mr. Theo Panagopoulos. Hey, Theo, didn't you used to work in Moscow?
Yes, I spent a year there in around 2000, which was quite interesting, and actually bought my first Russian or Soviet camera, the beautiful Kyiv 88.
And finally, from Gainesville, Florida, a city where I couldn't come up with any Soviet jokes, is Mr. Anthony Rue. Hey, Anthony, isn't Gainesville where Gatorade was invented?
Oh, it certainly was. There's even a Cade museum for Dr. Cade where you can actually visit a replica of the lab where the lightning struck and Gatorade was invented.
Tonight, we are going to talk about Soviet cameras in the Soviet industry with two special guests. The first is my personal friend and esteemed Soviet camera collector, Vladislav Kern. Welcome to the show, Vlad.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, guys. Good to be here.
It's been quite a while since you've been on the show. You were on some of our earlier episodes. Since the last time you're on the show, our listenership has grown quite a bit from the Facebook group that we're all pretty commonly posting in. So why don't you do a quick introduction of yourself, your site, for anybody who doesn't know who you are?
Yeah, I'm Vlad Kern. I run the site called ussrphoto.com, which is used to be a fairly popular forum. Now Facebook overtook it, so it's kind of sits there in the archival capacity, but you can still interact there. I've been a collector of Soviet cameras for close to 20 years. I'm at about 1,400 pieces right now of different Soviet cameras. So I pretty much collect everything Soviet, pre-Soviet, post-Soviet, anything from like all 15 republics that were part of USSR, and pretty much with anything with a Cyrillic writing on them. So this is one of my other things. And obviously, I kind of got suckered into collecting all the new lomography stuff because it's just very cool. Only the stuff that kind of resembles the Soviet stuff. So like all the clones of like LCA, the LCA pluses, and all the wides and all the instant backs, and that's kind of been a fun trip also. But yeah, I'm on Instagram as USSR Photo. I pretty much post my collection as soon as stuff arrives. So if you guys are interested in seeing some of the exotic Soviet stuff, head over there.
Awesome. Well, welcome. Also joining us all the way from the United Kingdom is Soviet collector and user Mark Beadle. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Hello there, everyone.
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, so I'm Mark Beadle, obviously from the UK, and I do a lot of shooting with Soviet cameras, much to be pain, but it is enjoyable. There's not really much to say for us other than that.
Okay. Well, welcome. Also here is returning frequent listeners and speakers and guests, Mark Faulkner and Nason. Welcome back, guys.
Hey, good evening.
Hello.
Good evening.
All right. So, it wouldn't be something I was involved in if there wasn't a little bit of history. So I kind of thought a good place to start on this show, maybe Vlad, you can kind of walk us through this, is one notable difference about the Soviet camera industry compared to, the Germans or the Japanese or the Americans is Canon, Nikon, Leica, Zeiss, Argus, Kodak. Those are all companies. American, German, and Japanese cameras were made by companies that wanted to sell them and make money. In the Soviet industry, there really weren't companies. There were factories. And there were different factories. Like in the Ukraine, you had the Arsenal factory, which is where the Kyivs were made. And that was like a former armory dating back, to like the 1700s or something like that? Is that right?
Yeah, close to that. Yeah, it's been there for a long time. There was a Tsarist armory factory for all the cannons and all the weaponry.
KMZ, outside of Moscow, which is where the Zenits and the Zorkis came from, didn't even make cameras until after the war. So a lot of these factories did other things, and they were moved into making cameras. They moved out of making cameras. Sometimes you would even have a model that was so popular, the same model will be made by different factories. So you could have a Zenit that's made in one factory, and then you could have a Zenit that's made somewhere else completely just to help pick up the demand. Could you speak to like why it is that way? Like what was different about the Soviet Union to where you'd have these factories that were just making cameras?
Well, first of all, there were not the factories making cameras. So most of these were state-sponsored factories that, for the most part, produce military stuff. And the cameras were really kind of like a cover. So, and on a lot of these factories, camera production was only consisted of about like 5 to 10% of the entire production. So, but when people were asked, "Hey, what do you do at this factory?" Like, we make cameras. But in reality, they're making military optics, basically like missile components, any kind of optical stuff for military tank sites, and anything you can think of. But the fun things about this, well, fun things, but the interesting things, I guess, of collecting Soviet stuff, because all these factories were pretty much top secret, most of the production. So the cameras also fell under the same umbrella. So a lot of the archives for all the camera production were pretty much secret. So there's not a lot of documentation. Only the stuff, a lot of the stuff was just the collectors' sponsored information, basically. So everything collectors were able to scrounge up and post on the web, or keep it in the records, or write books about it. Some enthusiast, after the collapse of Soviet Union, decided to go through archives. They were classified during Soviet Union, and started like putting the stuff out on the web. So there's nothing like the Leica, when you have like a catalog of serial numbers of all these cameras that if you have a Leica, then you basically always find it in the catalog. With Soviet cameras, you don't know what you're going to find. I mean, we find stuff that nobody knew existed. And I still have a few things on my shelf that nobody ever heard of. And they're like one of a kind. And they're obviously factory made prototypes, but nobody knows absolutely no information whatsoever about them. It's almost like playing a detective if you collecting Soviet cameras, because you really have to dig for information. And that's what attracted me to this hobby. And that's probably why I'm not interested in any other cameras about Soviet. I mean, it's very interesting history. I mean, it's dark history, but it's getting darker actually. But year over year, in the last couple of years, if you guys follow the news, but it's nevertheless, it's history. I think it's worth collecting. Finding Soviet stuff, it's really exciting, because you see stuff that people worked on, that spend their lives on designing, constructing, and it went under somebody's couch in some chest, and then finally their relatives found it and brought it out to light, and it turned out to be some very amazing technically prototype for the time when it was constructed. So because of it was all state sponsored, a lot of this was just not accessible to public. I mean, the cameras themselves in Soviet Union were viewed as a means to propaganda. I mean, that's how the camera industry was started in the 1920s. Lenin basically said, "What's going on? We need to get to people with to get the word to people to promote communism. So let's start taking pictures, start up some factories, and start making cameras domestically, and spread it to the people. And let's use those pictures to spread the communism throughout the world." That's really kind of how it all got kickstarted, and this was like the main idea behind the Soviet people having cameras.
Vlad, if I can ask you a question I've always been curious about,
Mm-hmm.
and in like pre-1990 Soviet Union, if you were, let's say, a young college student, you were interested in taking photographs, and you wanted a Fed 3, would you just go to a state store and find a Fed 3, or would it be that you go to the state store and you take whatever it is they made that month?
Yeah, I mean, some of the cameras. So a lot of the cameras that are metal and leather, basically cameras, not the plastic ones like Smenas. First of all, they were expensive. A lot of them were just sitting on the shelf and nobody was buying them. The ones that were in demand, they did fly off the shelves. So you have to kind of go through different stores and find them. So there was definitely a deficit on some stuff. If you're a student, you're most likely to pick up like a Smena camera. It depends what time period you were looking for. But I mean, the Smenas were always like, yeah, there you go. Theo got one. It's a Smena 8M. So yeah, those were like 15 rubles. And I mean, you can basically save up your little stipend and get one. And they actually took amazing pictures. The 8M, the lens on it is absolutely fantastic.
It is great, actually. They're a lot of fun.
Yeah, the lens is surprisingly sharp with the color film, and I mean, I actually like it with some more than some of the Zenits. I mean, it's like the pictures are just colors are just beautiful. I mean,
Would there have been like photo clubs, or would people have
oh,
developed their own
absolutely.
film or send them off? Or
Yeah, there was a lot of photo clubs. So I mean, and most of the people I know for black and white, including my family, were basically closing shades at night with some blankets and developing stuff in the kitchen or in the bathroom. I would set up the enlargers, and my dad would take off the lens of his Fat 3 and screw it into the enlarger, because it's the only one had like one lens to share between the two devices, and basically print pictures that way. But yeah, we did have a photo store right across the street from us that would develop color film, because color film, some enthusiasts would do it, but the chemicals were scarce, like a ready-made chemical. So some people, for example, like my father-in-law, would go to a chemistry store instead. So and he would actually mix his old chemicals. He would go on like with a list, and I think he was like 10 years old or 11 years old. He would come up with with a list to a store clerk and saying like, I need this, like whatever, potassium nitrate. I don't know. I don't know chemistry, guys. So he would give you like a very like exhaustive list for like color film development, and they would look at him like, hey, what does this kid want with all these chemicals? And he would go home and mix it up based on proportions, and just develop stuff like basically from elemental chemistry. But yeah, because some of the stuff was super expensive pre-mixed, and people were basically inventing inventive ways to develop film. I think people were like even like recording their own film or something like that. I mean, there's like doing some crazy stuff. I mean, it's one of the things in Soviet Union was like people like really knew how to recycle things. So there was like nothing would ever get thrown out. Everything was getting fixed. I mean, I would never know a person who would own like an iron, for example, for ironing clothes, and they would have it for like tens of years. And like if it breaks, I mean, they would try to fix it. They had like manuals. Like actually, the Soviet Union was pretty good about repair manuals on everything. Like literally everything. There was a lot of publications, a lot of magazines you could subscribe to, and tells you how to make your own things. So like you see, if you go to eBay, you will see a whole ton of these kind of stereo smenas that were like basically two cameras just kind of glued together. The mechanisms connected with a little like metal rod, and they'll solder together, so it's all synchronous. Synchronous shutters. All this stuff was basically, those are a magazine that would basically have articles telling you how to make those. A guy you might have heard of, Isaac Meisenberg. So he actually he moved to US, and he lived in Skokie, Illinois, which hilariously one of my relatives bought a house from him and lived in that house. But he was one of the most prolific writers on photographic subject in Soviet Union. He was a very famous repairman, and he, like all the repair guides, most of the repair guides were written by him. So it was like multiple editions of these repair guides. And he would write articles in his magazine saying how to like build your own camera, how to build your own stereo smena, how to like do a lot of things from scratch. I mean, the society was very frugal, so because there was a deficit of everything. So it was pretty interesting. Some of the homemade cameras I find is one of my topics of collection too. It's just absolutely mind-boggling stuff that you find like this, and some of this incredibly high quality. Like I have a Fat 3 that's a large format with the bellows and like some kind of rangefinder attached on the top, and they use all different parts from different cameras. It's totally crazy thing, and with a larger lens, no less. So it's a very interesting environment. So yes, they would develop stuff in house. People who could afford it would go to stores, but obviously black and white film was the go-to because it was mostly accessible, and the chemicals were mostly accessible. Although some of the earliest film would be so thick. I don't know if I told the story on the air before, but you couldn't use it on practical cameras because it completely grayed down the gears on it because they were plastic. So
wait, you said the film was thick?
The film was so thick. I mean, they would call it like oak quality film, you know.
Okay.
It was like very thick, and like
Wow.
it was really hard to move it. So the transfer mechanism, they had plastic sprockets. It would just grind down the gears. did this film after like some heavy use, and most of the cameras got some heavy use.
It's funny you mentioned that because the Leningrad, which was the wind up motor drive camera, that has such an abrupt and strong film transport that you have the opposite problem. If you put thin base film in, it'll just shred it. Like,
oh yeah,
it will actually snap the film in half because the film advance is so strong in that. So it was made for your thick film.
yeah, it's made for Soviet film because that stuff was indestructible. You can probably tow a car with it.
Vlad, in your introduction, you mentioned, and I might have misheard, for the pre-Soviet cameras.
Yeah, so there was a lot of some of the cameras. So there's a few cameras that were made during the Tsarist Russia, and the Tsarist Russia would. So the Ukraine was also part of Russia before the revolution. So there was a lot of companies that would import also the cameras into imperial Russia, and they would put their like little flags on them that had like a name of the importer, and it's all like in an old like Russian font with all these like characters that are not used anymore. So it's kind of cool. And there was a few pretty big importers. One was in Kharkov, which is now Ukraine, but so one of them was in Kharkov. A few of them were in Russia. So you would find a lot of the like French, German cameras. Some of the American cameras, they had these import tags on them. So that's one of my topics. But there were a few constructors in the Imperial Russia territory, basically, that were producing some original cameras. Mostly they were wooden pieces. So I don't think there's any metal pieces that were made there. Those are very, very rare. Like Karpov was one of the designers in Imperial Russia in about turn of the 20th century that would actually create his own cameras. He actually made a reflex camera almost like a Graflex, but it was wooden. It was large format, and there's a few examples and the kind of museum pieces.
So coming back to something that you had said earlier, so in the 50s and 60s and maybe into the 70s, the cameras like the Barnett copies and the Contax copies, those were primarily for export.
Well, a lot of the cameras were export just because Soviet Union was in dire need of hard currency. So
where were they going? I mean, were they going to East Germany, or were they going to
Australia?
Pretty much anywhere where you can get hard currency. So they were going to Australia under. So basically, there was this entity called Mashpribor-Torg, and the Mashpribor-Torg was the entity made for international trade for Soviet Union, and that entity was basically KGB. And they worked with a big distributor in London called TOE London, Technical Optical Equipment London, and which also employed a lot of KGB. So that entity was the main. They would get these exported cameras. They were a lot of the time they had their own technicians that would refurbish them, and then you had different international entities buying from TOE London. So, for example, in US, there was Kalimar that already towards the end of the 1970s were buying massive amounts of Zenits from POE London, and they would rebrand them to put Kalimar signs on them, or they would have like actually through TOE, through Mashpribor-Torg, they would order custom silk screening that would say Kalimar on the cameras. Plus, they would also resell them to Quantaray, as a Ritz camera.
Yeah, that's Ritz camera.
Right, so they would resell them. So they actually made the signs that under the name Delta One, and they would make the signs for them. They would brand them. The Kalimar, I would sell them already branded to Quantaray. Also Cambridge, I think it's Connecticut, New York, yeah, and
New York, yeah,
right.
Cambridge. So
the Cambron brand, so they would also rebrand them as Cambrons, the Kalimar, and they would sell them to Cambridge. There's a number of like different entities. This is just US. So then there's Australia, the global brand that would re-engrave as global. So the Australians were probably getting it from TOA as well. There's tons of Zenits under different names. UK, Mark, what was the UK ones? Mark, what were the UK Zenits? There was a Prince Flex, right? And there was also
there's a Prince Flex. There was Globals doing the rounds as well, going through Dixon's. So they're obviously quite often related to like Australia, but they seem to find the way into the UK market. And
and there was the SLX, right? The Zenith SLX that was also like
yes, SLX. Yeah. I'm the
I think I have an entire bookshelf with about 5 shelves full of different branded Zeniths for different countries. I mean, there's tons of Japanese ones too, like Mepro Zenith E Pro. If they're all the same, like Zenith E, Zenith EM, and Zenith B in some cases, they're just basically rebranded for different countries. Some of them just like little stickers on them, like some are like metal text, some of them actually custom silk screening. France had the Faulkner Zenith RX2, I believe. Those Canadian ones too. So there's quite a few. And Brazil was actually making their own parts, and they were actually slapping them onto the Belarusian Zeniths. So it's quite an industry.
I have a question from Mark Beadle. So going back pre-Soviet Union collapsing, I don't think, or at least it was very rare to see a Soviet camera in the United States. I don't think too many ever made it here, other than maybe the Calamars, like you had mentioned. But my understanding is in the UK, it was much easier to find Soviet cameras or even some like East German cameras. Is that right? Was that like the entry-level camera would be something Soviet or East German?
Definitely. Pretty much everybody started with a Zenith. Every loft has got at least one in. And it's, I think it's quite telling. Well, marketplace is pretty saturated with them.
So, Zeniths are compared to the Japanese are fairly rudimentary, but they're very stout cameras. They can take a lot of abuse, and they're, like Vlad said, people would fix a lot of their own cameras. So I would assume that if one went bad, it wasn't that hard to get working again. So what was like the general reputation of Soviet camera stuff? Was it, cheap but good, or did professional photographers sort of look down upon people who use Soviet cameras?
I think everybody always looked and thought like Nikon and Canon were the best, but nobody really turned the nose up to it. I think people really admire the people with the guilt to actually go and get the camera, use it, repair it, and then they always look to move on afterwards.
It was a respectable way to get started in photography if you didn't have a lot of money or just didn't really have the aspirations to be a pro.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Is that because the actual cameras that were exported were aimed at getting mass market, so it wouldn't necessarily be the better quality Soviet cameras, because obviously the ranges varied. So that's why you would get that reputation where you'd have, like in the UK, Dixon's, and the catalog place was it Argus would be selling those. You'd have Hanamex rebranding here as well, some of them as well. Is that kind of the strategy that the Soviet camera makers were actually aiming at, to try and just get mass market?
I think it looked that way to me. I think Vlad will answer that better, but it certainly seemed that way. They wanted us to have as many people holding their cameras in their hands as possible.
Yeah, because the Soviet currency was kind of artificially inflated. The labor was fairly cheap, so all the stuff was exported. I mean, for in UK or US, I mean, you would get for like £70 or $70, you could get like a leather metal camera, where a comparable like Nikon or Canon would be about $300-400. And if you look at on paper, specs would be like very, very similar in some of the things. So I mean, a lot of people gravitated towards kind of getting like a nice, sturdy looking camera for a good price, just as a starter camera. And the Soviets could produce them in pretty big quantity, especially Zenith E's. I mean, they were made like in millions. I think close to like 5 million or something like that, and a lot of them were exported. So, and it was actually a really good camera. I mean, I still like see Helios lenses being sold for a crazy amount of money at this point, and they only going up in price. So, I mean, you would get a hell of a camera for a fraction of the price. So, and
that's exactly what I was thinking as well. I mean, the lenses itself speaks for itself, doesn't it? It's like, it's the Zeiss design, and people wanted find that perfect niche where they were like, were paying enough where you were happy with the quality, but you wanted that like decent quality lens, and you were getting a lot more for your money from the Soviet camera.
Are those Zeniths? I'm not that familiar with them. Are they primarily M42 mount?
Primarily, yes. M42, M39 for the older ones. There's a few proprietary mounts, like the Start has like kind of like an Exacta type of mount on it. Not quite, so you can't really fit it on it, but it's very similar. Some of them have the K mount, later ones. So
Paul just showed one today with a K mount. Do you have it in front of you, Paul?
I have the 212 and the 412. The 212 is thread mount. Is the 412 K mount?
if the one that says K after it, the 212 is the K mount. It's a 212K.
Yeah,
so
it is.
That would be the K mount.
And it's interesting because later, you didn't see it too much early on, but the Soviet photo industry eventually did adopt the Japanese mounts, like the Pentax mount. Some of the later Kyiv SLRs actually use the Nikon F mount. So you can get Soviet cameras with K mount bayonets, the Nikon bayonets, and a few of their own proprietary ones.
Yeah, this is K mount. It's
Yeah.
a 212K. The 412 is thread mount, which seems a little odd to me, but I guess that they were making them both mounts.
Because they made so many more lenses in the M42 mount, so they don't want to like lock people into K mount. There was like very, very few K mount lenses in like USSR or like former territories. Because what you have there is actually a camera like from Russia or at this point. It was made like in the early 2000s. So at that point, like a lot of people had like tons of M42 lenses, and K mounts were kind of a little bit harder to get. So
when the factory made like Zenits, do they make cameras specifically for export and different quality levels of control?
They did have a separate assembly line. They did try to do higher quality for export just because they cared more about like their reputation abroad. But the stuff that was going to like TOE, they knew it's gonna get like refurbished anyways before it got sold. So some of the stuff, I mean, they would actually re-CLA these cameras once they got them, the TOE. Before they sold them, they would like go through their own quality control.
Well, the reason I asked, because I didn't sell them, but I had access to the Zenits through Calamar.
Mm-hmm.
Calamar was a distributor in the U.S. And honestly, I didn't sell a lot of them, but I don't recall there being a lot of problems. They were relatively sturdy camera. They were heavy. But back in that time period, a lot of cameras were heavy. I don't remember them being exceptionally primitive. Do you, Ray? Do you remember back in those days?
You know, we kind of shied away from those. We had an awful lot being so close to New York City that a lot of the popular catalog stores in New York would really push either their brand or the Zenit brand. I had quite a few used. I had a better relationship with one of my customers. His dad worked for a certain film manufacturing company that was based near Boston that was going back and forth to Moscow often. And he would bring me Kyiv 60s, Kyiv 88s, Solettes for like $10 a piece. It was crazy just how cheap it was. And he's like, yeah, look at it. I brought you a camera. You got $10? Sure. All the time.
So what was your impression of them when you saw these things? I mean, for $10.
They were awesome. Are you kidding?
Yeah,
Even by today's standards. The first one I saw, I had a customer. He was, I can't remember his name, but he was a very famous stamp collector from Moscow. And he came over and wrote his book and did his memoirs. And he brought one of his relatives in with a Kyiv 60, with the 80, with the 30 fisheye, with a 120. And they wanted to sell it to me. But he wanted like, $10,000. And I'm like, you're crazy. I think I bought it for $100. But the negotiation was really cool. The optics are remarkable. The build quality was really, really quite good. And I was told that the way that the camera was on the Kyivs anyway, if it was in Cyrillic, it wasn't for export. If it was in more of a Roman style lettering, it was for export.
That's correct.
And that's the way I looked at it in my time frame. I know I have a lot of Feds, a lot of Zorkis that are kind of the same deal that have Cyrillic on them. And I was always under the illusion that those were not for export.
That's correct. Yeah, actually, you would find a lot of the Latin script ones outside of former Soviet Union.
Yes.
But they did, I mean, sometimes they supplemented with the regular Cyrillic versions as well, just if they were running out of them. But Kyivs are like amazing cameras. I mean, Arsenal did a really good job in when the USSR fell apart and Ukraine was trying to kind of privatize all the factories, Arsenal was trying to like really push the Kyivs because I mean they kind of ended up like in an open market, in a free market that had a lot of competition at the point from all the Japanese brands. So we're trying to like stand out themselves, and the quality was a little bit subpar. So they spun off a few entities. Like for example, there was I don't know if you're familiar, in US, there was a company called Kyiv USA.
Yes, Saul Kaminsky. I
Yeah.
knew Saul very well.
So he actually had a series of from people working from Arsenal, so they would actually move to US from Arsenal and refurbishing cameras here, and they would put like closed shutters on them. They would redo some of the mechanics, and those, if you find those cameras with those little Kyiv USA tags on them, they're especially the 60s and the 88s and the 88 CMs, they're just fantastic cameras. I mean, right now is the only one entity like that's left, I think, is Arax. I think Hardlight was also around, but I don't think
I think they're done. I remember looking at their website a year or two ago, and I think they're done. Or
they seem to be more doing lenses now, Hoplite, don't they?
No, okay.
Yeah, I've got to say that the Arax cameras are amazing.
Yeah,
it's like day and night between the.
They'll even improve them. Won't they? Won't RX add features that weren't originally on them?
Oh yeah,
like a mirror lockup.
Yeah,
the mirror lockup, and you got the standard Pentagon mounts on those because they're like the CMs. They could install those, and they do all the. I mean, I have a black RX. I think it's an 88 CM with the mirror lockup on it. It's absolutely fantastic camera. I mean, like I actually shot a wedding with it. It was the pictures came out like really nicely. It's operated as smooth as like any kind of Hasselblad. And actually I was walking with it for the parking lot, and this guys just like see me like carrying this thing, and they're like, oh, Hasselbladsky. You know, so that was kind of funny. They recognize what I had on my hands. But yeah, fantastic cameras, and Eric's still doing a great job. So they're still around. They're still really active on social media. So I mean, they would refurbish your camera. You can get cameras directly from them. They also fix any kind of modern Kyiv cameras, and people are really happy with their production. So we're the only relics that's kind of remnant still, and still like nice and alive and kicking, and doing a really good job. So
they also machine parts.
Yeah,
they make a lot of adapters and various other things that are not just for the Soviet cameras, but for other mounts.
No, really? Okay.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. I mean, very high quality machine tool shop work.
Yeah, I mean, these are all ex-Arsenal guys.
The highly skilled guys, I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe they all came out of Arsenal. So all these guys are like used to work at Arsenal at some point until the Arsenal kind of closed down. There's really like nothing left of that factory right now. They're demolishing it, and before the war started, they started on the territory. They started building these very expensive high-rise, like posh condos, towers, because it's like a very prime real estate in the center of Kyiv by the river. So it has the view, and basically that it's like basically any developer's dream. So they started basically demolishing all the old workshops, and at some point, unfortunately, some of the stuff that they had in archives, they said that it's still classified even after the collapse of Soviet Union. So a lot of the literature, a lot of the cameras that they had, like their prototypes, they just basically went under press. Everything was burned. It's just a travesty. I mean, some of the guys that were there telling me the stories, it was absolutely, they were just watching all this priceless documents and stuff just kind of being burned just because of the bureaucracy. It was very unfortunate. All that information that then went with it was also lost. So that's the problem about the Soviet industry, that the information was very hard to come by, and you a lot of this word of mouth, and then stuff gets like proven and disproven like pretty much every day.
Well, we're talking about photography for the masses, basically, in service to the state. The motion picture industry would have been much more valuable. So was there a state photography agency aside from TASS? Was there something where the state used photography and developed it for that sort of purpose?
So motion picture stuff, if you're talking about movie cameras,
yes.
It was like the professional stuff was very specialized. There were a few like very expensive like cameras like canvas and the optics are like ridiculous. They go for like $10,000 right now because they're really popular in Hollywood right now. If you put out like some Lomo like OKS lens, and if you look for Lomo OKS lens on eBay, I mean you will see the prices because for some reason it's very highly regarded in Hollywood and they actually shoot a lot of movies with them, especially some of the anamorphic stuff. A lot of the stuff very specialized, so it wasn't geared towards the masses. It was made in very small quantities, so it's kind of hard to get and was kind of procured for these movie studios that were shooting. Plus, a lot of these companies would get Western equipment to do that as well, because when they wanted highest quality, they would go to Western equipment. Same with publications. I know a few journalists that were basically bought Nikon's Canons, and that was during the Soviet times. Just they would get like special fund for high quality pictures for magazines that would go to Western equipment. Yes, they had like a whole arsenal of all the Soviet cameras, and I know a lot of people that use Praktikas. So practical lenses on Zenit cameras because the practical bodies couldn't stand up to Soviet film. But there was a special fund, I guess, to get higher quality stuff.
Paul, I would say that, going back to the 1920s and 30s, the USSR was, such a largely sprawling and considerably illiterate country that the leadership saw motion pictures as a way to communicate to the masses what the Soviet Union was about. And so they would hire filmmakers like Dziga Vertov. They had propaganda trains where they would go out with these trains and shoot sort of documentary footage in the day of like a factory at work or workers in a field. And then at night, the train would pull into town and they'd crank out the projector, project it on a sheet on the side of the train, and the whole town would come out and watch what was going on. And then they saw motion pictures as a way not only to spread the idea of Sovietism in the country, but also as an export as well. So there was always a lot of privilege to the motion picture industry that I don't think that the still photography industry had. I mean, I'd heard stories of even like, when things got pretty tough under Stalin, and there was a period where Stalin saw this as so important that he personally had to approve every script that was filmed, and it choked the Soviet film industry down from producing, several hundred films a year to doing like 20 films a year. But they, there were state film schools. They were using a lot of French equipment to shoot with. And it was always given sort of a high priority as one of the most effective tools in the propaganda quiver that they had. So there's like a big difference between the film industry and the still camera industry.
In the West, no one knew a Russian photographer, a Soviet photographer, but they knew who Potemkin, they knew who Sergei Eisenstein was. They knew about Potemkin. They knew the films.
Yeah.
Because they were so beautifully done, and they were art. And I don't know how much service they were to the state, but they were certainly
well, they were seen as a massive service to the state. But I would argue that people knew who Rodchenko was. People knew that, I mean, because there were enough Soviet photographers that were like crossover to Bauhaus in Germany in the 1930s.
Okay.
That there was a certain Soviet style of photography that is still influential. Maybe not as well known as Cartier-Bresson and the European, but there were some brilliant Soviet photographers.
Yeah, but as to equipment, in pre-war times, I mean, none of these guys used Soviet equipment. There were very, very few. I mean, I know Rodchenko used the Leica, so I mean, I don't think he ever used the Soviet camera. So the motion picture guys, I mean, there was like, in terms of movie cameras, there was only like a couple that were made, and they were like in the single digits.
So Vlad, for how important the propaganda was and for the Soviet government to get their message out, but then there were all these talented people shooting French, German equipment. Is that really what the motivation was in the 30s to start reproducing Leicas? We know today, most collectors who are familiar with Soviet cameras, we know about Feds and we know about Zorkis, but there were other Leica copies that started production in the 30s that didn't really last. But isn't it true that the government was like, we must make our own?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, there was too many people in USSR, and there was a huge shortage with equipment, and with communists being kind of like going up in scale, and USSR being getting more and more isolated during the years leading up to World War II. I mean, the stuff that trickling to Soviet Union was kind of very limited, so they had to start doing their own production, and so the Leicas were like in the 1930s. They basically said like we want these different entities to come up with a like alternative. There was the Wump that was making a prototype. Then there was
Pioneer.
the Fed was making a product. Yeah, the Wump Pioneer. And there was a FOG, FAG, that was making a prototype, and they were up for like kind of state review. And so there's only like a few of the quantity of the other ones, but the Fed was the one that was given basically the state contract to make these, just because I don't know how true it is that they had like the cheap labor, because it was basically based on the children's commune. They still had the adult designers and the constructors, but the children were kind of helping out in the workshops. I mean, they were kind of put to work to do like kind of some of the assembly line work. But they saw this as like a big opportunity to kind of get something started with some like existing infrastructure in place, because those guys were already making electric drills at Fed, so they already had the mechanical workshops. So they started basically they gave the production to Fed, and the other ones that just kind of exist in maybe double digits copies that collectors are really running after. I mean, I think one was sold for $100,000. Wow. One of the wartime Wump Pioneers that mounts on a photo sniper, on a prototype FS3 photo sniper. They went an Vienna auction for, it was about 100,000. So that stuff gets up there in price just because of scarcity, but it's pretty so and then after the war, because there was even more demand for cameras, they kind of the production got picked up by KMZ in Krasnogorsk near Moscow. So they started the parallel Fed Zorky and then eventually Zorky production. Actually, during the post-war, there was also Arsenal factory that tried to make Fed as well. It's a very little known fact. There was a camera called Fed Arsenal.
Oh, really?
With an Arsenal logo on top of it. I think I know only about single-digit quantity of these that existed. Very, very scarce camera, but it never went anywhere because Kyiv was given the Dresden and Jena factory stuff to build contact copies. So they kind of abandoned the whole Fed idea and started building their own.
You've touched on a couple of different things I want to ask you about, but there's so many things to talk about. I don't want to dominate the discussion, but we know that Fed was a commune where orphans lived. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so out west, our knowledge of the Soviet camera industry was almost nothing. Very, very little really even was known here until the years after the Soviet Union fell. So, we can look up on the internet a lot of this stuff and sites like yours and mine and at least find bits and pieces of these stories. But I think the first stories that came out about the Fed factory is it was literally like Little Orphan Annie was putting together Fed cameras. And while that might be true, wasn't it more like a trade school? These kids lived there. And they were fed and clothed and everything, but they had to give something back. So they were taught a trade, and they were right. Is that correct?
Right. So this was really the street urchins that was a big problem in the 30s in USSR. They had a lot of street urchins that were basically causing a lot of crimes on the street. They were stealing, pickpocketing, and all sorts of stuff, having like juvenile gangs. So they basically decided to kind of get these kids off the street, put them in commune. And there was a guy who was like a very famous educator, Anton Makarenko, and he had his own like work and study type of philosophy that he basically employed in this commune. So they would basically study and work at the same time, manufacturing various things. So they started with, as I said, with the drills. And then they went into like assembling the Fed cameras. So yes, it's true the little kids were making Feds, but no, not really true, because they were doing some of the aspects of the assembly, but there were definitely adult factory workers there.
You had to work your way up to it, right? Like you had to show up, an aptitude to be able to put. Okay, that's kind of what I thought. I am sure that by today's modern working conditions, what they were subjected to is probably pretty cruel. But I'm sure
I don't know. Here in the U.S., they're rolling back minimum wage for
yeah.
factory work to 14. So
I was gonna say, we were sending children down in coal mines in the 30s, working 12-hour days too. So I feel like there's a little bit of like adjustment to be made. Like these kids and young people that were putting together these cameras, the alternative was they were homeless on the street.
Right.
But at least they had a home, at least they had a meal, they were taught something. I'm not trying to like make it sound super noble, but I don't think it's quite as sinister as some of the early versions of the story kind of made it out to be.
well, now in Arkansas, you can have a 14-year-old, cleaning the rendering vat at the Swift slaughterhouse.
A side story is the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago has a wonderful coal mine exhibit. It's actually one of their original exhibits. They relocated bits and pieces of an actual coal mine into basically a basement of the museum in Chicago, and you could take a coal mine elevator. It's really, really cool. If you've ever been to Chicago, go to the Museum of Science and Industry, check out the coal mine exhibit. But anyway, so I took my 2 kids down there about a year ago. My daughter, who's 6 at the time, when like a week after we had done this, right? So it's like you kind of think they forgot about it. And my daughter comes up to me and goes, "Daddy, when I'm older, I don't want to work in a coal mine." And I was like, "Why? Like, what made you think of that?" And she goes, "Those kids were probably very dirty." And I laughed. There's that innocence of a kid, but like, they were telling us like in that tour that children were down there, and there was dust everywhere. And these people they'd have these lamps that if the flame turned blue, run. Because there's methane down there and stuff like that. So, and this was in America. So to think that, at the same time in Ukraine, you had these factories and these people were building cameras and drills and stuff that was actually useful. I think it's kind of cool.
I need to ask, does the homework situation now become like, do your homework or otherwise you'll end up in the coal mine?
Coal mine. Yeah. I haven't had you do that yet, but you know what? I think that's good. Yeah. Or if they don't take the dishes out, I'm like, all right, you have to scoop some coal.
Oh, Theo's turning into Anton Makarenko here.
Vlad, I've got a question I'm curious about. As somebody who's a Soviet camera collector, do you consider like the sphere of influence? Do you consider the East German cameras, the Czech cameras, and that one Hungarian camera to be part of the Soviet camera sphere, or is it?
I don't. I consider the core Soviet republics. These were just influenced. Yeah, the Eastern Bloc. So, what is that mic showing? What is that thing?
It's the Hungarian camera. It's the Momenta 3.
I knew there was one.
Nice.
There's actually I have a whole book about Hungarian cameras. Believe it or not, there's a bunch. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it was within arm's reach, so I couldn't resist.
Well, classically, the Soviet cameras are the ones that come out of the 15 Soviet republics. So they were actually the Soviet Union. The rest is just, you can call them communist country cameras or something. I don't know. But yeah, they're not Soviet.
Not of interest to you.
No, except I take very small interest in some of the Chinese cameras, just because the Soviets gave them the plans to Smena. So there are Smena. There's a 1-to-1 copy, the Chinese version, and there's also the Lubitel, and there's a FAD too, actually, as well, and some of the Zenit. So and they're really, really rare. I only have the Smena out of the Chinese ones, but I think just because they're like identical copies with just like Chinese markings on them, that those are kind of interesting. But
so okay, that's a topic I want to talk about today too. But didn't at least a portion of the Chinese camera industry, didn't they receive assistance from some of the Soviet factories?
They either bought or they just given them the the drawings for the cameras just as like a gesture of goodwill, because they wanted China to be like very close friends with, and because they're like fellow communist country.
Because there's a Chinese copy of the first Zenit SLR, which, if you consider a Zenit like an SLR version of a Leica, it's like they had the Leica, they made the Fed turned into the Zorky turned into the Zenit, and then now the Chinese are making their own copy of a Soviet camera. So that hierarchy of DNA that exists in some of the early Chinese cameras. I was holding up a Shanghai 58, which I realize has nothing to do with the Soviet camera, but it's the only one I have. So
did you have any of Kurt's Chinese cameras, or did you send them all to me?
that's what this is. This is one of Kurt's.
Okay.
I think I have like a Great Wall, one or two of the SLRs.
I have pigeons and seagulls.
Yeah.
I've got at least 2 boxes of them.
I think I did save one of the TLRs. It's not a 5 goats though, so I know Theo's been looking after one of those.
Yes.
Kurt had, he had an interest in the Soviet camera industry, and I wish he could be here because I think this would have been a show he'd have been really, really interested in. Because I mean, clearly the guy did have an interest in some of these earlier cameras, and 2 of them that I kind of wanted to show. I figured at some point we'd get into a gas discussion. But one of the cameras that I never even thought I would ever have a chance to, and I've showed this one to Vlad before, but this is called the Sport. So this is a 35 millimeter SLR camera. Some people, depending on your allegiance, will say the Exacta was the first. The Kine Exacta was the first 35 millimeter SLR, and that is true if you go by when it was commercially available to buy, because the Exacta did go on sale before this did. But this camera in prototype form existed 2-3 years before you could get it. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, as Gilvetta. Yeah, it was called Gilvetta before.
So this camera is a 35 millimeter SLR. It does have a focal plane shutter, but it's metal. It's like a trapdoor kind of. It doesn't have a cloth shutter. And you look down upon it through a wasteful finder from the top. It's got a little knob on the side here, which is used for both cocking the shutter and setting shutter speeds. Really neat little camera. And to think that this was the first real attempt at a 35 millimeter SLR, and it's a Soviet camera. You'll find a lot of examples of firsts, that the Soviets did. We talked in the last episode, I had a section where we talked about mirror lenses. The guy who actually invented the cat-eye dioptric lens for telescopes was Russian.
Yeah, Maksutov.
And that's what I love about the Soviet industry, or the Soviet camera industry, is, I'm in the United States. There was very little information out here. In my time doing the Kepler's Vault articles for my site, I would just go through hundreds of old pop and modern photography magazines, and every once in a great while you'd find this article, and you could tell the editors that were writing it were like, gee whiz, look what the commies are doing, and they would write these like whimsical articles about like they'd get their hands on a Kyiv or a Fed or something. One of them even had a Leningrad. Like, I don't even know how an American magazine in the 50s would get a hold of one of those, but they would write these sort of like, the communists are coming up with these cool cameras. They're of course not as good as the Germans, but sometimes that stuff would leak out over here. But I don't think we really had a grasp for how rich and how thorough and how big that industry was. I mean, the people who aren't who are listening to this from home, you can't see Vlad's background. I've been there multiple times before. You could find pictures of Vlad's collection. I mean, for the guys on the show looking at his picture right now, that's like a quarter of what he's got. That whole room is filled with cameras on all 4 sides. He's got a whole other section of his house with cabinets just like that, just filled with stuff. And I mean, and you don't even have everything, I mean, I've asked, hey, Vlad, do you have this camera? He's like, he goes, no, there's only 2 of those. There's so much that was done there. And like he mentioned earlier, these rare prototypes and stuff that wasn't documented, lenses that shouldn't even be on certain bodies that somebody pieced together. It's so interesting to hear these stories about how the Fed factory got started, how the government basically said, we need to make our own Leicas. I love the story of how the Kyiv rangefinder was even made. I've covered it a bunch of times. We don't have to really cover it here too much, but Dresden was the camera capital of Germany before and during the war. And after the war, Germany got split up. East Germany went to the Soviet Union. Well, that's where Dresden was. That's where Zeiss Jena was. So for war reparations, the Soviet Union said, well, you're making some of the world's best cameras and optics. We want to make cameras and optics too. So we're taking it all. Unlike the Feds and Zorkis, which are actual copies, where they reverse engineered the Leica and made their own cameras. The Kyivs aren't copies. They are genuine Contax cameras, the first of which were built from spare parts. Some of the machinery was moved over. As time went on, that machinery wore down, and they didn't innovate. So as the years went by, I think the Kyivs got less and less German. But find a 50s Kyiv rangefinder, get it serviced, because let's be honest, the original Zeisses need to be serviced too. But a serviced 50. He's showing a picture of all his Kyivs. Find a serviced 50s Kyiv rangefinder, and it is every bit as good as the Zeiss Icon Contaxes are, because it's the same camera. They literally just picked up the factory, moved it to another country, and just kept making them. And they did that until the 80s. And I know you guys know this. I love the history of the stories behind all these cameras. They're just it's so cool, and I just love. I mean, Vlad, if I didn't know you, I wouldn't know squat. Like I wouldn't have been able to publish nearly as much, because for you guys, even Theo, Mark, and Anthony. I mean, there's so many times I'm like, hey, Vlad, can you translate this for me? Or what do you know about this? Or I'll type something up and then I'll give it to him and say, did I get this right? And he'll be like, you're close enough, So, I mean, I owe a lot of this research I've been able to do on my Soviet reviews to you, because, you've kind of helped me with some of those stories. And that's why it's just so exciting for me to have you here and listen to your stories.
Thank you.
Well, I'm curious about something. Vlad, do you actually, when you take pictures, do you shoot them with a Soviet camera?
He shoots an Nikon.
No.
I was going to say, we heard about the Nikon story.
Well, I sometimes pick up a Soviet camera. I used to shoot quite a few of my cameras. Then I kind of picked up a Nikon FM and didn't go back.
Well, no, I'm not pointing fingers. The reason I ask is I have never taken a picture with a Soviet camera.
You're missing out.
I've shot piles of Soviet lenses. I mean, I love the Soviet lens. The Jupiter 9, maybe my favorite Soviet, my favorite portrait lens of all time is a Jupiter 9. I have Helios 44s that were originally made for an SLR and 39 millimeter mount that I adapted them to 42 and use them on mirrorless cameras. There's just the rendering of some of the older Soviet lenses is just really, really cool.
The Helios is the whole swirly bokeh thing is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think you can get that kind of effect anywhere else.
Well, I took it one step farther. I had two of them, and I reversed the front element on one. I reversed the rear element on the second one. And they don't focus to infinity, but they sure give you the swirls.
Nice. What does the front element reversal do, though? I know about the rear.
Well, the front lets it focus closer. It focuses to I think it's maximum focus distance is probably 2 feet, and minimum is less than that, but not a lot less. Even someone who has no mechanical skills can reverse the elements on those lenses. They unscrew very, very easily.
Paul, for your first Soviet camera, I'm gonna say something I think Vlad's gonna approve of. Find a Smina 8.
I have
one of these.
Two of them. I have two of them new in boxes.
Is it the 8 or the 8M?
I haven't taken them out of the boxes yet. They can record stuff. There are two of them.
The 8M is the modernized 8. Literally, it's exactly the same camera. They just basically started making more lighter version of it and a more cheaper version of it. But yeah, they both excellent.
Yes.
I've actually seen someone that's pulled the 8M lens off and converted it to Leica mount. So enamored with it. So the 8M, the Smina 8M is just an amazing toy to play with, basically. But the results, it's something you would never expect.
I think that was Piero, wasn't it?
Pierre.
He's like Stephen at Cosmo Photos friend.
Yes. It's
lens off. He's a really good technician. Him.
Is that the guy who's selling all these modifications on eBay? Because there's quite a few of them for sale that you can. They take off everything. They take off like the Agat lens, and they take off all those hard mounted lenses, and they basically put them on like an M42 mounts or like M39, and those are a lot of fun.
Now I know Anthony, you have a fondness for the Agat 18 and the 18K as well. The only reason I would not recommend that as a first Soviet camera is those are incredibly finicky.
Yeah.
To use, loading film in them. I mean, you literally like collapse the camera in half, and they can be a little bit tricky to use, but the results are definitely worth it. But if Paul or anybody listening to this show has never shot a Soviet camera, I mean, obviously most people are going to think of the Zenits and the Zorkis. The Zorky 4 is a great camera. The Fed 2, I love the Fed 2. But the Smena 8 you can get for peanuts. You could probably buy these by the box still from some Russian or Ukrainian seller. And they're so basic, they almost always work. I think they're very comfortable. And if there's one thing, you spoke about this earlier, Vlad, that the Soviet Union did really, really well is make good triplets. Soviet triplet lenses are amazing. I would even argue I've seen better results from some of these 3-element lenses than I've seen from some Tessars. The Voskad has a similar lens on it too. That's just wonderful. The image quality is it's weird because like it's not like, you know how some lenses can be so sharp and so precise that it almost looks sterile, like with no character at all. Like I think you can go too far with sharpness. So these aren't quite like that, but they look gorgeous. They render colors, contrast. They don't really have a lot of over the top vignetting. You're not going to get swirly bokeh from this. You're just going to get all around really good lenses. I'm sorry, really good images from a fairly basic plastic camera with a triplet lens.
And pick up the 8M instead. It's much easier to load and use, and they're lighter too than these guys, and they break less.
All right. Well, I don't have an 8M. But I'll
the older form factor, which is like the 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
Manas, they're like, if you drop them, they just like crack and like chip off, and the 8M is like you just throw it against the wall.
Let's try that and see what happens.
No, don't do that. Oh my god, it gave me a heart attack here.
All right, so we've clearly gone into a gas section here. I mean, apart from the common Soviet cameras, I think most everybody knows about. Mark Faulkner, haven't heard from you. You got to have some cool Soviet cameras there that you could share, right?
I have a few. I mean, my favorite is the Kyiv. I've got the black version. I've got this one. I've got the one you're talking about, the half frame. I guess they're 18K one.
Yeah.
Largely, I've got a couple of Feds, which I think shoot better than some of the old Leicas I've got. They just seem like they, all weather conditions, they seem to do better than some of the old Leicas.
One thing that I've observed with a limited, I'll admit, a limited sample size, but I've seen enough Soviet cameras and Canons and Leicas and Leotaxes and whatever. It seems like the cloth curtains that are used on Soviet cameras do a better job of holding up today and resisting pinholes. Minolta made a 35 millimeter Leica copy simply called the Minolta 35. And I don't think there's a single one of those out there anywhere that doesn't have rotted curtains. They turn to dust. I don't know what the heck kind of rubber coating they put, but they did not last. My first Leica was actually a Leica 1B. It was like shooting into a starry sky projector. There were thousands of pinholes. I had a Canon 2B, completely rotted out curtains. But yet I've had, now the straps can break. I've seen that, where the curtain completely just falls off the track and it doesn't even move at all. But in terms of pinholes, if you can get a cloth focal plane Fed or Zorky and just take the lens off, look through it, fire it. If you see it fire, I would be shocked if you have pinholes in it. They, for whatever reason, hold up.
The Fat 2s, I always find a bunch of them with pinholes because people put them down with the lens up, and that Industars 26, it just burns the hole right through it. Yeah,
you do that.
No, they were already like that. No, I actually did shoot the 2. It was awesome.
All right. Well, I'll acknowledge, other than user error, I will make a general observation that I believe that the Soviet cloth curtains seem to hold up better on average. Yeah, I'm sure someone's going to say, oh, mine's dead, but I've had pretty good luck.
They're thicker. And maybe, why I have a suspicion like this, the Soviet cameras are not as tightly sealed as the Western counterparts. So they don't like rot stuff. So stuff doesn't rot because there's like air movement inside.
So the Lubitels are really popular. People like to shoot those. Wasn't the Lubitel originally based off the Fotlander Brilliant?
Brilliant, yeah.
Brilliant, yeah. Which Paul's got a bunch of those, so he's pretty excited to hear that.
Well, the Komsomolets was based exactly on the Brilliant, and then the Lubitel was basically an evolution of that when they coupled the lenses.
I really like the Kyiv 19. That's the one that has the Nikon F mount.
Yeah.
That's one of the more Japanese, and I say Japanese because it looks and feels like a Japanese camera, but it was made in the Soviet Union in the late 70s, early 80s. Works really, really well. I enjoyed using mine. I love the shutter design of the earlier Kyiv 10 and 15. It has a focal plane shutter
Oh,
that
yeah.
has a fan, but those are not reliable. To find one of those that works at all is rare, but they're still very cool, very collectible.
Well, the shutters work, the meters don't. That's the problem in that one.
One camera that I really have had a lot of fun with, and it'd have to be probably one of my best ones to enjoy, is the little Kyiv 30.
Yeah. Oh, they're fantastic.
They are fantastic. They're superb. I just had so much fun with that. Reliable. This thing's built like a tank. It's tiny, but it's built like a tank, and it just works. There's nothing on it that you can look at and say, okay, that's going to break, or you have to be gentle with it. It just works properly. It took the actual results astounded me on such a small frame. For people listening, the Kyiv 30 is actually is it 16 millimeter?
Yeah, it's a 16. It's a Minolta 16 copy.
Yeah, so it's tiny. So, and there was a version made which looks like the John Player Special cigarette packets, which was very popular as well. So Mark's got one there as well.
No,
and
nice.
have you shot with yours, Mark?
Not yet, no. I've been sadly reluctant in shooting any 60mm film for a while, so I'll try to get on it.
Do. You'll really enjoy this.
I have to say that I've had better results out of my 30 than I have over any other 16mm camera. It's actually a lot of fun to shoot, and it produces, again, lenses really great. Like, it's the right lens for 16mm.
But you do have to put on a fedora hat and a trench coat and run around and be a spy.
Have you compared it to Minolta 16? I've never shot one of the 16mm ones. I was just wondering how they compared to the Minoltas, which were they copied from.
I haven't actually shot the Minolta yet, so I can't compare. Anthony, you've done both, haven't you?
No, I've got a Minolta, but it doesn't work. It was DOA.
I think Bob Radoloni has like a whole bunch of them for sale.
Yeah, he does.
At the camera show.
Well, you know, I got to say, I'm surprised that nobody's mentioned the Lomo LCA, which, is the camera that based on the Cosina CS2, but kicked off the whole lomography craze. And I've got like an original Soviet. Would it have been Soviet or would it have been Russian at that point?
That was Soviet. It was 1983, I think. That's when they started making those.
I've got an original LCA, and it's just a lot of fun. It always produces an interesting shot. And then I also like the two half frame cameras that I have. The Belomo, is it Chaika, the Seagull?
Chaika, yeah.
And then also the Fed Micron. Okay. Both of them are affordable and very capable half frame cameras. Yeah. But I got to tell you, the one Soviet camera that I've run more film through than any other is the Horizon, the original swing lens, not the plasticky ones, but the metal one. And that camera, I produced some fantastic work with that camera.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in getting into like a swing lens, I'd highly recommend the Horizon.
They're like 1/10 the price of a wide lux. So
absolutely.
You could buy 4 Horizons, send them all out to Oleg for a CLA, and still come out ahead of buying one wide lux, which if that breaks, you can't get fixed.
For some reason, I found the 202, the plastic version, just a little bit nicer to work with because it's the same exact camera, just lighter to carry around. And I've actually lugged it around for like a week in Paris, taking pictures of all the panoramic stuff in like museums, and it came out really nice. I mean, the metal one that I had it fixed by Yuri in Fatka, one of his repair guys, but it was like it was keep giving me problems all the time because it's like it's the actual axle on which the swing drum sits. And a lot of this is kind of like skewed sometimes, so and it starts getting stuck. I don't know why, and I've had it on a couple of them, and plus the film, the whatever thing that presses the film sides, I've had problems with that too. So like I would actually get like blur on the very edge of the frame for some reason on the metal one. The 202 for some reason never gave me that issue.
I've had more problems with light leak on 202s, and I own both versions, and I've owned wide lux, and I'm about to buy another one. Don't ask me why. The 202 have had more problems with, again, light leaks, and I find the color better, but the original metal version is higher in contrast and sharper.
Interesting.
That's my experience. And, I think I own 4 of the original ones right now and 2 of the later models that, after Manfrotto came in. I have one for export and one that Manfrotto was selling in the US. And then I have one directly from Ukraine.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, the metal Horizon or Horizont, that's what it actually says on it, has the same lens that the KGB F-21 camera actually.
Called the OF-28P.
With the lens?
It's a 28 millimeter. It's a triplet, Soviet triplet.
It's the same exact lens on those spy cameras they had that were classified.
You loaned me the Ajax, and I shot it. Got some pretty neat results from it. But yes, the Horizon is an incredible value. They do tend to need some servicing. They may not always fire smoothly. But if you're a fan of swing lens, the Horizon does 58 millimeter wide panoramic images. The X-pan ratio is 65. I think the wide lux is 65 millimeter. But if you want to go wide, you got to go to the KMZ, the FT2, which is a really bizarre looking. If you didn't know what it was, it doesn't even look like a camera. It's a rectangular black metal box with like knobs on the top, and it shoots 24. This is regular 35 millimeter film. It shoots a 24 by 110 millimeter panoramic image. I mean, it's just you get 12 exposures on a 36 exposure roll of 35 millimeter film. They're not the easiest to find in the United States. I don't think they were all that common. I don't think there were a ton made, certainly less than the Horizons. And they are a little tricky to load. But if you have one and it works and you're willing to go through the effort to load them, that is truly a camera that makes an image that no other camera can do.
Like that camera also requires its own special cassette.
It does, yes. Yeah, you got it.
And it's been the bugaboo for me is everyone I picked up has been missing cassettes. And, now this talks about 3D printing cassettes.
3D printing, yep.
So this camera was actually constructed by Fedor Tokarev. It's the same guy who did the TT pistol and the FT2s. And it was actually made as a FT1 first. So there's actually 3 versions, FT1, FT2, and FT3. But only the FT2 was the one that was put to mass production. The camera was originally designed to do the pictures of artillery shelling on the battlefield. And then they decided to put it as like a mass-produced panoramic camera, but that was the original intent of it. And it was based on that Kodak. Don't remember the name since I'm not into Kodaks, but there's a Kodak swing lens. So there was loosely
the panorama.
Yeah, it has like a little. Yeah, it's also a box, and there's like a little lens. So basically, was loosely based because the reason I know that because
it is as Mike holds one up.
Oh, that's the one. Yeah. So basically, Tokarev's estate was for sale in Russia about maybe 6 years ago, and they were selling all his personal collection, and so he had a whole bunch of different prototypes for sale, and some of them were like half built, like FT cameras, and one of them was like heavily modified Kodak. With his own invention, so you can kind of see that where he got the idea from. So it was kind of translated in his own. It's a really interesting looking camera too, the FT2. I mean, I call it it looks like an old voltmeter. That's what I call
it. Sitting on a shelf, unless you were into cameras, you would not know it's a camera because it just simply doesn't look like one.
Some kind of electrical device.
Yeah. I have 2, one that I've shot, and then I have another one brand new, or I shouldn't say brand new, but in its original box. Really nice shape. I like them. They aren't the easiest to load though. If you thought, I mean, does it have a bubble level? I think they do.
Yeah,
I don't have it
on top of it. Yes,
it's built into the little thing.
Getting an image that's effectively 110 millimeters wide level is really hard to do. Like it's hard to do on any swing lens, but you're shooting an image that's essentially 2 Horizons put together. Real quick, we were talking about half frame briefly. I've never shot a Fed Micron, but I definitely like the Sheikas. I have the Sheika 3, great camera. Another triplet that just shoots really. Mark's got that's
Sheikas. Yeah, they're fun.
Those are really really nice. That's the 2. The 3 has like a square shutter release button on the front, but otherwise it's basically the same camera. Very very nice.
The 3 has the meter, I think, too, on it.
Yeah, it's got an uncoupled Soviet.
Right, selenium.
ghost, film speed, meter. We gotta figure it all out, but it works pretty neat. All right, so real quick, we have about half hour to go in recording here. I thought it might be fun to do Soviet Mythbusters. So Vlad, I'm gonna read off to you a couple myths or common things you hear about Soviet cameras, and let us know if it's true or not, or if there's any truth to it whatsoever. Okay. All right. So the first one is that there are a bunch of Soviet cameras. The lubricant on them is made from animal fat.
No, it's actually a story that we've heard from somebody that worked in one of these factories. It was in Belarus, the I don't know, how do you say that, Belarusian or Belarusian? And I heard both versions in English. But the Zinnes, they're made in Vileyka, which is basically near Minsk. This was a second production of Zinnes after Russian factory KMZ. There was a grandma, and I think I've told that story in one of the podcasts already, but there was a grandma in the end, the assembly line that was basically doing like quality control, and then one day she quit, and all of a sudden the quality of entire assembly line went down, and they couldn't figure out what's going on, and they're calling her and like, what did you do in the end of the assembly line to make all the cameras work so smoothly and nicely? She's like, I would rub them with some bacon fat,
I knew the bacon fat would come up at some point.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, this is a popular story because I think I said that I think I told the story on Classic Lenses, and it's been following me ever since.
Well, we are the remnants of Classic Lenses before.
Right.
So all right, so lube from animal fat, bacon fat is confirmed. The second one, kind of already.
Sorry to interrupt, but
No,
there is. Well, on a serious note regarding that, yes, the Soviet lubrication was made out of organic fat, though.
Okay.
It wasn't because it was bacon fat, but it was organically based versus not like synthetic that the German cameras used. So that's why it hardened so much, and that's why you find all the Soviet cameras are like very, very, very stiff.
But do they smell nice when you heat them up?
Can't hate bacon.
Get some bacon bits in there.
Well, speaking of that, I had a guy find like about 40 Zorki in his oven after like 5 years not knowing where they are, because he wouldn't bake. But one day he decided to bake a pizza, and he opens it up, and he started preheating, and he smelled something burning, and there was like a whole bunch of Zorkis in there.
The next one, we kind of already talked about this a little, but I'll ask it anyway. But that KMZ cameras built for export were of higher quality. So you kind of already confirmed that earlier, right?
Yeah, most of the time, yes.
Yeah, okay. One that I've seen a lot is that lenses with the serial number, it starts with 00, were made for VIPs.
No, that's not true.
So there's nothing special if you see a lens that starts with 00?
In my experience, I found a lot of the export cameras actually have 00, so it might have been an export prefix.
Okay. There are whole warehouses full of unused Soviet lenses that are still being discovered today.
Sometimes. Yeah. Not anymore, probably, but I've heard a few stories of in the last 10 years that did happen. One guy discovered about I think 300 or 500 Zenit ETs sealed in boxes. So he just started like taking lenses off and selling them on eBay.
So when you would see like a Ukrainian seller with like literal piles and piles of the same lens, there's a chance that's where it came from, or maybe a repair shop that just ripped all the lenses off.
Some, yeah. I mean, if you see they're consistently like like sequential serial numbers, that actually happened too. Then yeah.
Because I took the string off, but I have like this Kyiv 35A that was not only its original box, but it had string wrapped around it. So nice. I assume this was unused stock somewhere.
That probably is.
Okay.
When those hit the U.S. market, Mike, we had it was a handful of people selling them, and for every one you sold, you replaced it 4 or 5 times.
Oh, jeez.
They were not reliable, but they were very, very, very cool, and they put hurting on the Minox 35 market without question.
Yeah, they're very light leaky, but the lens on that thing is ridiculous.
Yeah, the lens is awesome.
Okay. One of them I was going to ask about the orphan children, but we already talked about that. And then the last one is you should never change shutter speeds on a Soviet camera until after cocking the shutter.
Not all of them.
Not all of them.
Like something like a Narcissus. Yeah, the Zeniths, I've never had a problem. Some of the old Zorkis maybe, but it's some like the Narcissus especially is very, very, if you do that, it's done. But yeah, the Zorky 4 probably could withstand it easily.
So the Narcissus is a 16 millimeter SLR with a screw mount. It's got interchangeable viewfinders. You can get it. This has the prism, but you could get it with a waist level, fully flash synchronized. It's got a cloth focal plane shutter from 1/2 a second to 1/500th of a second. Very, very cool camera. One of the very few 16 millimeter SLRs that I've ever seen.
Well, it was the smallest 16 millimeter SLR for a long time, I think, until the Pentax made that little one.
Yeah, and I don't know how rare this is, but this one came with a lens adapter that allows you to mount M39 screw mount lenses to it. So I can put
actually rare. Well, if it's the original one,
it's made out of metal. So here, watch this. I'll show you. Here is a Narcissus with a Nikkor 50 millimeter lens on it. Now it only does macro that way, but pretty cool. All right, that concludes. I couldn't think of any other ones.
I have a question to try and check Vlad's knowledge.
Go ahead.
Fed. Who was Fed named after? And if you can remember that without looking it up.
It's Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky. He was basically the head of NKVD. A very sinister name for a very beneficial, I guess, commune of kids. But he actually died the year they named that colony. So I guess it was kind of like immemorial. But this is basically the head of what you later known as KGB, the founder.
The checker.
Right.
I mainly wanted to hear you pronounce it actually because I've only seen it in writing.
I definitely couldn't have done that. Say it again, Vlad. What was his name?
Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky.
Dzerzhinsky. Okay. Yeah. All right. Did you have a question, Paul?
Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that the Russians actually made the rarest Leica lens ever produced. It's a 50 millimeter 3.5 Summicron, which the Germans never made.
Is that
they're in M39 remake? Mount? It actually says Leica 1913 to 1931 engraved on the side.
Wow, that's nice that they told you that.
It's got a wonderful metal lens cap that says Leica Summicron 35 millimeter. I mean, when you see the Germans, they only made 50 millimeter 3.5 Elmars. The Russians actually made a Summicron 50 millimeter 3.5. So it's extremely rare. And I've actually used it. It's a really good lens.
Very cool.
Well, the Industar 50, that's a pretty decent lens, actually. Oh, there's Ira.
Hey, Ira, sorry, I didn't see you in the waiting room there. I wasn't looking anymore.
Yeah, I was running late today.
That's okay. We have Vlad on. We're talking Soviet cameras, so I'm sure you got something special.
Oh yeah, I wanted to show something really special. There's the red book. Nothing, no pun intended. That big fat red book about Soviet cameras.
Princel. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't go away.
This is gotta be good.
I think Vlad saw this already. If you look all the way towards the end of the book, there's a camera called military camera.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't have a name.
What page was it?
It's towards the back.
Oh, that doesn't help me.
Nobody still knows to this day what that thing is.
Exactly. It's just this military camera.
Did you put that viewfinder on it?
Yes.
You have like this pretty viewfinder. Is that a Leica?
Originally came like this with the tripod mount on top. If you look in the book, it's upside down like this. Now I don't know, maybe they hung it from something, because if you hold it upside down, the advance wheel is right where your finger is. So who knows? But I just thought you might want to see something like that.
That is very cool.
That is neat. It's kind of appropriate you're here, Ira, because just the other day you showed me a camera that you wanted my opinion on. You had found a Reed camera, a British Reed, which was like their version of the Leica.
Everybody said that was a fake.
Yeah, well, you didn't know that though. You're like, I found a prototype Reed 1 and wanted to know my opinion of it. And I looked at it, and I mean, it looks like a Leica 1. And I always thought all the Reeds had rangefinders. But where my spidey senses started tingling was, if this was real, it would have been made in the 30s And it has a very blue lens-coated lens that looks awfully like an Industar. And whoever took this took the time to sand down the Soviet markings and engrave Taylor,
Hobson.
Around the shutter speed. Mark, you're gonna have to pronounce it like Leicester, Lei.
Leicester.
Leicester. I don't know how. Yeah, Leicester,
it's called
England.
Leicester.
Reed in Sigrist. It's got the Reed logo engraved into it, but I'm like, boy, that looks Soviet to me. So they've escalated from making fake Leicas to now there's fake Reeds out there.
Oh, I saw plenty of fake Leica copies. The best one I still remember was a French Leica copy called the Segem. I've never seen a real one, but the one I saw was absolutely a Fed because it had that telltale viewfinder. They can't change that, along with the little triangular, I think, rangefinder cam instead of a roller one.
Somebody tried to sell me a Fed the other day at the show that had the roller one. And I was like, what is that? It was the opposite.
Yeah, what happened is they got a Leica. And they tried.
No, it was just repaired, I think. It was strange. It was definitely a Fed, but it was just the insides were really strange.
All right, I'm gonna test Vlad's knowledge of rangefinder couplings. So you guys were talking about on a real Leica and almost all the Japanese copies, the coupling arm has a wheel on the end of it for smoothness. And pretty much all the Soviet cameras is just a rigid arm, like a finger. Okay. Name one Soviet M39 interchangeable lens rangefinder that actually does have the roller from the factory, not modified. They all have it. What I think there's only one.
Would be the Fat 6 TTL?
Not the one I'm thinking of.
Drug?
There you go. Yep, the Drug.
I figured it had to be either the Drug or the Leningrad.
All right.
Yeah, the Leningrad does not. The Leningrad's a solid arm, but the Drug has. If you look in there, it has the wheel exactly like a Leica. I mean, I'm spinning it with my finger now, so it's very smooth. I love the Drug. This camera has the trigger film advance in the bottom, like the Canon VT Deluxe, like the Leica Vit does. Another thing a feature that this camera has that doesn't really, you don't realize it until you pick it up, but the viewfinder is in the center. It's directly above the taking lens. So that helps to minimize parallax error. There's almost no parallax error.
I still have yet to figure out why lights stuck it off to the side.
Yeah. So all they did was shift. I mean, the rangefinder window is here on the far side, but you look it through the center. There's a very bright viewfinder. This thing has a fairly decently large rangefinder patch. It has the projected frame lines for 50 millimeters, and I'm going to guess that's 85, maybe 90. I'm not sure.
How much did you shoot it, Mike?
I've shot this one once. The shutter does work. The problem it has is the film advance is messed up on it. So like I'll get 3 shots in a row where they're spaced properly, and then 10 of them will overlap.
So mine works really well, and I've shot quite a few rolls through it. The only problem is the advance, that little lever in the bottom, it's really, really sharp. So on the second film, I'm like, my hands were actually bleeding. My fingers were bleeding. Yeah, it's pretty brutal.
This one's not too bad. It's not very stiff because there's a chain under there that it uses to advance.
Mine's like semi-stiff, but it works really, really well with shutter and everything else. But
you bought a Drug from me. Did you get a chance to play with that?
Yes. So the shutter doesn't travel all the way. The second curtain just stays kind of open, crack open, and it's good on the faster speeds, but on the slower it doesn't close all the way. But it's actually in a better working shape than I've seen any other Drug, because most of them, 90% of them that I find, they don't work at all. Like that thing is jammed.
Send that one to me.
Which one? That one? We'll talk about
that one. I can fix the second curtain failure. It's fine. I'm all right with that. It's mine has the overlapping issues as well.
So we're running low on time here. Ira, you just kind of came in here, so welcome. Of course, you're always welcome on the show. So many cool things you have. Does anybody have any questions for Vlad or Mark, or you want to talk about something else completely?
I do have one question.
Sure.
Yeah, as usual, I'm always in awe in terms of Vlad's collection and the way it's displayed. It's just and the way he actually seems to put all the like cameras together. that does take a lot of effort. But do you find it you obviously live in the US now. Do you find it difficult because you're away from the ex-Soviet countries to actually find things? Is it a disadvantage, or do you have a network that's pretty much taking care of that for you?
I have a network, but obviously Russia is closed right now. But there's quite a few things that are coming from Ukraine. But interestingly enough, the most rare cameras I bought in US, just because people don't know what it is and just basically dumping it off. But right. My most priciest and like the most valuable in terms of like collector's value, the stuff that you don't see, or some prototypes that were found in the United States.
Vlad, tell us real quick the story about those two. What is it? The TVS,
TSVS.
Yeah, real
prototypes.
quick. Yeah. Do that story real quick.
So the guy who bought it, he's a long-time member on my forum, and so that this is a camera that basically looks like a Fed with a Contax mount on it. It's a very unique camera, and nobody knows. It was a lot of legends going around where they come from. Like people, there are like a bunch of different things, like people saying there was made some factory in Almaz, when I first held one, it was maybe like about 15 to 17 years ago, and it felt nothing like a Soviet camera. It was like very smooth. All the mechanics like basically screamed the German camera to me. So that's why like it was very doubtful that some kind of unknown Soviet factory was making these. So there was always suspicion that it was coming from Germany. And then finally, we found a book. So the TSVVS stands for Topographical Service, like a military topographical service for Soviet Union. For some reason, these cameras were only given to like high-ranking officers, but nobody knew where they came from. Somebody found a book that was written on the history of topographical service and found a little excerpt saying that right after the war, there was a factory in Hildebrand, Hildebrand factory in Freiburg, Germany, that made cameras based on like for Soviet order for the topographical service, and then basically we deduced that these were the cameras, but nobody had any kind of proof to it. And then I had one of the longtime forum members all of a sudden posted two of these cameras with absolutely no writings on them. So they're just kind of blanks. But those were for sure those TSVVS. Those were like the Fed-looking cameras with basically Leicas with a Contax mount, which is really strange.
Didn't you say these things were just sitting on a shelf in like a pawn shop?
Yeah. So this was absolutely, he had no knowledge whatsoever about this other book. So this was before that. He went to Freiburg, Germany for vacation. He went to the antique store in Freiburg, Germany, and these were sitting in an antique store and the shelf for like about 50 euros each. So he's like, what are these? And the guy's like, oh, you don't want them, they don't work. He's like, no, how much? He's like, 50 euro. And so he bought them, and then eventually he was raising some money for his children, and so he decided to sell them to me, just because, I guess. Nice. He enjoyed the forum, so I ended up buying those things, those two cameras from him.
Very cool.
And they're basically prototypes for the TSVVS cameras because they're blank. One of them is actually very shiny, polished chrome, which I've never seen a version like that of the TSVVS. Mostly they kind of like a dull chrome with like a star on top. This is TSVVS, but this is like very interesting.
Vlad, do you have any idea why the viewfinder is so damn tiny on those things?
Yeah, all the Feds and like all the old Leicas. I mean, so they're all based around like a Leica 2 base, and they were all tiny. And
no, but this is like 1/4 the size of a regular Leica viewfinder of the same period.
I have no idea why they like that, to be honest. I mean, I think it's just this was a German factory, but I don't think this is a factory that actually manufactured cameras before, to be honest. So maybe it was some kind of design oversight that because of the inexperience, or maybe some kind of limitation, but it is very interesting. They come like that. I mean, I think there's only like about 1,000 or a little bit over that amount of these cameras made.
Well, between you, Vlad, and Ira, I've seen 3 of them in person.
There's not a lot of them, and they're all numbered, so I haven't seen a number higher than like 1,400 or something like that on those. So it's a quite interesting story. It was if you go to the USR Photo Forum, there's been like so many threads over the years and debating on the origin of this. It's like people were just it's like a very epic investigation.
But to kind of circle back to Theo's question about how easy or difficult it might be for Vlad to get stuff, I'll reflect back to something Ira said. in one of the previous episodes you were on, the more people you know, the more things you have access to, you know,
sure.
like this group of people from this podcast, the Facebook group, the old Classic Lenses podcast, your website, my website, Ray, you know, I would have never in a million years come across a Konica F if it wasn't for you, you know, and I think that I'll get a little sentimental here again. But that's one thing that's great about this hobby is, you know, everybody, whether you're a Soviet collector, whether you like rare prototypes, whether you're into toy cameras, you know, sub minis, you know, Robert's into Nikons, and there's just so many people that are willing to share and give that information. And I mean, I can't say I don't know what it's like to collect vintage guitars or something. I don't know if it's the same way for that too, but you know, I've just found so many people willing to share, help people find rare stuff. Maybe you find something that's cool, but it's like, this isn't my thing. I'm going to pass it along to somebody that I know is going to appreciate it. I've seen Vlad's collection in person. I've seen Ira's, and right here, those two are the most impressive collections I've seen. You know, Ira, just the sheer volume of stuff you have, but Vlad, the presentation. Theo, you ever come to Chicago, you got to get over there. Vlad's an awesome host. He, in addition to,
and a good cook.
He's a great cook. He'll feed you grasshoppers. He's got an excellent collection of bourbons and scotches. He's got a wicked, awesome sense of music. He likes some great bands.
Have I just been invited to Vlad's house by everybody but Vlad himself?
No, everybody's always welcome. I just couldn't get a word in, but yeah, I was gonna say.
Sorry,
you're in Chicago area.
Yeah,
you are welcome.
It's cool. Because you got like an old Soviet TV that you gutted and put like an LCD or LED panel in there.
Wow.
You've got just cool stuff everywhere. Like you'll be in his basement and there's an easement window. You'll just look outside and he's got like a little monument outside with like little figurines and decorations and stuff like that. It's so cool.
It's all Soviet themed. I mean, it's historically themed to match the collection, really. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'll stop raving about someone else's house. So we're down to the last 10 minutes. Anybody else have any questions or anything you want to bring up? We lost Anthony. He's a little under the weather. So hopefully he feels better soon. Mark Beadle, great to have you on the show. I know it's the middle of the night. He's at work. So I saw his video come and go throughout the show. I don't even know if he's still there, but I'm glad to have him on. Someone else that loves these cameras as much as I think a lot of us do. Hopefully between the people on the show, Theo, you said you didn't think you'd have a lot to contribute. I don't know the people listening to the show, how many people are already interested in Soviet cameras that are listening, or maybe just didn't. But maybe we've spoken about a couple different cameras that are worth checking out. You know, if you still have that very antiquated belief that Soviet cameras are inferior, they certainly did make some cheap ones. They certainly made some rudimentary cameras, but there's a lot of great ones. There's a lot of innovative cameras that are very, very cool. Their lenses are great. Pretty much anything with a triplet was usually an economically priced camera, like the Sminas. The Chaikas are great shooters. The Agat 18K is awesome. I love the Kyiv 17 and 19 that I mentioned earlier. They have the later Zeniths that use the K mount. The Lubitels are nice. They're basic, but they shoot really nice images. They made 16 millimeter cameras. I don't think they ever made film for it, but there was at once a Polaroid instant camera the Soviet Union made. You have the Moskva folders, which are copies, I think, of the Super Icontas, which are quite good.
The Iskras too.
Yeah, the Iskra, that's a great one too. You let me borrow one of those. It's got a coupled rangefinder, automatic exposure counter on it. You know, a little bit hard to find in good working order, but like any camera that era with proper lubrication and, you know, a CLA, they're wonderful shooters. They really are.
To find somebody who takes the Iskra lens, the Industar 58, I think, on it, and like puts it on like a M39 mount or something, or M40, even M42 mount. Because that lens is probably one of the best lenses I've seen in a Soviet camera. That and the Helios 77 M4, that lens is my primary shooter for anything portrait. It's swirly and it's razor sharp. I mean, it's really rare combination because the 44s are kind of like soft. The 77 M4 is. I know Mark really likes that lens too. Didn't you shoot that one, Mark?
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's got even more swirls than a 44 too, which I find hard to believe, but it does have it, and it has the sharpness in abundance. It's truly a fantastic lens and a great recommendation.
Yeah, they're hard to find though. I mean, they're very scarce, and if you find them, they're pretty pricey for a Soviet lens.
One last question, and then we'll go, because I'm surprised I didn't think to ask it sooner. But if you do have a Soviet camera and want to get it repaired, you mentioned Fedka already. I mentioned Oleg in Slovakia. But do you know of any other options in the U.S. or anybody that you would trust sending a Soviet camera to for repair?
In U.S., no, but I think Mark uses Roger Lean in UK. It's kind of he's completely analog, so I think Mark, how do you get a hold of him?
You have to be one of the lucky few to have his phone number. It doesn't like to be advertised too much either. He's a quaint guy, but he's very good.
Yeah, he's really good from what I heard, and he's the former TOE London technician, right?
Yeah.
Well, we'll try to get as much as we didn't do much of the Instagram with the last episode. That's difficult for us to do sometimes, but we'll try to make sure we get as many of these cameras we showed or talked about on the show on the Instagram and the Facebook page for you guys to see. I had a great time. Vlad, thank you so much for coming. Mark, thank you for coming in the middle of the night while you're working. Ray, Mark Faulkner, Ira, it's always great to have you guys. This was super fascinating. I love the Soviet camera industry. The fact that we've talked about it so often on the show and never dedicated an entire episode to it, I'm amazed it took us this long to do it. So I wanted to say thank you guys. We don't quite yet know exactly what we're doing for the next episode, although I do have kind of a theory as to what we're going to do, but we do have some exciting episodes coming up soon. The next show will be recorded in 2 weeks. So that would be Monday, October 16th. We'll be recording episode 57. I hope to get this episode out hopefully by the end of this week so you guys can listen to it. I wanted to say thank you guys for everybody who listened to our last episode, which ironically, even though it was our last episode, was our most listened to episode in the first week of any episode we've ever had. So clearly our break between season 2 and season 3 did not slow down your appetite for the world's best, only fastest growing open source film photography podcast. Thank you guys for coming, and everybody have a great night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Have a nice night, gentlemen.
Good night, all.
Take care.
You know what the problem is when we get Vlad on? I just get this Soviet camera gas every time. Really strong because he's got such a great collection. It just drives you straight away.
Yeah.
It's a shame the secret police took Anthony away though.
Comrade Anthony is being regrouped.